Tēnā koutou katoa and a very warm welcome to this New Zealand Family Violence Clearinghouse webinar. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko Nicola Payton taku ingoa, he kaimahi mo New Zealand Family Violence Clearinghouse. So I'm Nicola Payton, the manager of the Clearinghouse, which is your National Centre for Family and Whānau Violence Research and Information. Before we welcome our panel of speakers for today's webinar on COVID-19 and family and whānau violence, I'll quickly run through some of the Zoom features of Zoom webinar. So lots of you have jumped on the chat box, which is great, and please do pop any comments that you'd like to share with the rest of the people in the webinar in the chat box there. You're also welcome to use the chat box if you're having any technical issues and you would like some assistance, please pop your issue in the chat box and we will try to assist. You'll see there's also a separate box for Q&A. Please only use the Q&A box if you have a question you'd like to put to our panellists. This helps us keep track of all your questions and our panellists will get through as many questions as they can at the end. Please note that if we consider any comments to be disrespectful or offensive, we do reserve the right to remove people from the webinar at our discretion. And today's webinar is being recorded and we will email the link out to all of you next week. So today's webinar is a bit of a different format from our previous webinars. It will be a corridor or conversation between our panellists, wonderful panellists here, for about an hour. And then after that, we'll have time for questions from participants. Our panellists have a really wide range of experiences and views. We're talking about big issues and this isn't a webinar or panel about one way of looking at things or one experience. So it's a chance for people to explore and discuss different experiences and opportunities. In one webinar, of course, we're not able to cover every issue that's come up in relation to COVID-19 and family and whānau violence. But our panellists are all really wonderful advocates and thinkers in this space, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them about their knowledge and ideas. Okay, I'll hand over to the panellists now.
E ngā mana i ngā reo i ngā kārangarangatanga o te motu, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, kia koutou e huihui nei i te ata nei, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko te tūmanako aha ko ngā piki me ngā heke, kia kahara tātou, kia kahara tātai i roto i a tātai nei mahi, me pehe te mahi hei hāpai nā whānau, nā wāhine, nā tamariki, me nā tānei hoki. Nō reira, i runga i te kaupapa nei, nei rā te tino mihi kia koutou o tira kia tātou. Kai noi tātou. Unuhia, unuhia ki te urutapu nui kia wātea kia māmā te nākau. Te tinana te wairua i te ara takatū, koia rā e rongo whakairi ake ki runga hai. Turu o wituakamawa kia tīna, aumie, uie, tai kie. E rere kauna te awa tipua mai nā ka ui maanga ki Tangaroa, ko au te awa, ko te awa ko au. He uri a hau no te awa Wanganui, me ki nā te hawa ki Taumarunui. He uri huki anō no ngā puhi mō Tūwhareto, mō Maniapoto, me ngā tirau kawa hoki, korihi tinana taku nei ingoa. Welcome everybody, welcome to this webinar and to this conversation. It's my hope and our hope that you know, even though the work is hard and often challenging, that we continue to do the work in all the sectors that continue to do the work to reduce violence, whānau, family, other sexual violence, in order to grow a society that flourishes in the transformation of peace, goodwill and good health. My name's Rahi, and I'm a kaupapa Māori researcher with Ngā Waia Tatui Kaupapa Māori Research Centre at Unitec. My background is in whānau ora and whānau therapy, and moved from that space into the research and writing space as a kaupapa Māori researcher. So I'm going to hand it over to the other panellists to introduce themselves. Ngā mihi.
Tēnā koutou katoa, I'm Rachel Smith. I'm the Senior Manager of Professional Practice at Shine. I've worked in the family violence area for many years. In the NGO space now, I've worked for government. So I've worked for the Family Violence Death Review Committee for about 7 years, and previously worked in the UK doing frontline advocacy work, as well as within government areas there, and also the health system here in Aotearoa. So wonderful to be here today. Thank you. Hand over to Denise, mate.
Kia ora no tātou, e kauria ki te mihi ki a koe rahi, ki te fruit tūwharatia. A tātou hui i te rānei, ki te huaki i te ara mō tātou kaupapa, mō tātou whakawhitiwhiti kōrero, e pāna te kaupapa kei wainganui a tātou. Tēnei te mihi ki a koe. Ka huri au ki te mihi ki a koutou, ka noho ana kei wainganui te zui, I tēnei rā, tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Kia ora, my name is Denise. I'm from Ngāti Pukinga, ki Waiau here in Hauraki. I've had several lives at this mahi, but I have a background in counselling. I'm a Māori activist, have been for most of my life. And I suppose I'm participating in this today to share some of the lessons that we have learned here in Hauraki around COVID-19 and what that may mean in the context of whānau violence and what the real pandemic is. Kia ora, I'll just leave it there.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou. Ko Waiau, ko Kariori te mauna, ko Whainaro te moana, ko Tainui te iwi ko Ngāti Kahanga te hapu. Ko Denise Wilson ahau. Kia ora koutou. My name's Denise Wilson. I am a researcher at AUT University. I've got a background in working in the family violence area as a researcher and on various things. I spent 6 years on the Family Violence Death Review Committee. I currently am on the Family Violence Prevention Expert Advisory Group and a subject matter expert working with the joint venture business unit. So it's really good to be here, like Denise and Rehi. You know, we want things to improve and be better. So this conversation today will be really good to be part of. Kia ora.
Once again, kia ora and warm ethnic greetings. My name is Sheila Nair. I'm a practicing counselor and a senior advisor with Shakti, which is a 25-year-old organization that has been working with migrant and refugee communities with particular emphasis and focus on Asian, African, and Middle Eastern women, children, and young persons, mainly youth. We have 5 culturally specialist refuges spread throughout New Zealand, a 24/7 crisis line. We funded Shakti, and we have centres spread across Auckland, Christchurch, Tauranga, Wellington, and Dunedin. I think before I proceed, I would like to thank Nicola and the Clearinghouse team for getting this panel together to discuss some pressing issues that in the current context of COVID-19. And I'm happy to be here to be given an opportunity to represent the issues of some of the most vulnerable segments of our communities and their experiences of violence, particularly in the context of COVID-19. I think, as we all know, family violence, domestic violence is actually a social pandemic, and how it manifests in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic is a very important discussion to have. Kira, and thank you.
Kia ora, and thank you very much all. So I wonder if we want to make a start by asking each of you to talk a bit about the work that you've been doing, the mahi you've been doing in the last few months of COVID-19, the groups that you work with, and just what you've seen in terms of what's been happening for those communities, for those groups during lockdowns, after lockdowns, the wider effects of this pandemic.
Oh, kia ora. I may as well jump in now. I forgot, so my current role is I'm the General Manager for Te Whāriki Mana Wahine o Hauraki. Here in Hauraki, Coromandel Peninsula, for some of you that don't know where Hauraki is. And in particular, I think one of the key learnings that we got from COVID-19 was what happens for Māori who live in their iwi kāinga, who live in rural communities, coastal communities. And what we learned was our whānau were able to mobilise immediately to support their rangatahi, their kuia, their karawa, and the rest of the villages. And so I'm not just talking about one village, I'm talking about several. We were able to mobilise ourselves immediately. Our services were able to also mobilise pretty much immediately as well. And what did that mobilisation include? That mobilisation included ensuring that whānau who needed to have access to kaipaks could have those. We continued to deliver our usual 24/7 hours a week services. So they still remained open. All our services remained open, available to the whānau. And one of the other things that we learnt was that not having government agencies in our faces all day, every day worked. It gave us the space to develop our own solutions and to get on with the mahi. The other thing we learned was that some of the government agencies weren't able to respond in a timely manner. So we had civil defence falling all over themselves, you know, in the rural areas, bursting people's bubbles because they didn't know who the whānau were, where they were going and how to get to them. So there were those sorts of things. What we also saw was government throwing money at us and enabling us to get on and do the work. And what we're seeing now is that as we've moved down lockdown levels, then what we're seeing is government now getting back in our faces, trying to control the narratives, trying to control the strategies, want to know what our intelligence is around working on the ground so they can develop national strategies. What for a little village like Manaia or Haratonga in the Coromandel Peninsula just doesn't make sense. And I think the other thing we learnt was government's messaging didn't serve some of our whānau well. For example, the message of stay home, stay safe was a message that's counterintuitive when you're working in the area of whānau violence. And whānau and wahine and some of our tamariki and some of our men as well needed to leave their homes to be safe. Anyway, I'll just leave it there.
I think as regards working with migrant and refugee communities, I think the first initial awareness was the overwhelming, it was rather overwhelming for us, having taken on board the understanding that our communities, when we say migrant and refugee communities, essentially come from overseas. So we have an ongoing migration that was occurring close to that time. We had people of members of these communities coming in and going out. So I think we were quite concerned in terms of how our communities were responding to COVID-19 in terms of containing or even preventing COVID from being part of becoming part of their lives. So I think we were acutely aware of that scenario of the potential for safety of these communities as well as wider New Zealand as well. So I think the initial things that we worked on was actually a COVID risk assessment policy, which we had to do, and we were happy to send it out as whoever wanted that, which actually are specifics about their being in New Zealand, and if they had association with others who were coming in and out of New Zealand. And besides that, I think we also developed a risk assessment policy specific to the context of domestic violence in the midst of COVID. So because I think intimate partner terrorism took on a new dimension in terms of the family violence context, because the women from our communities, many of them, I wouldn't say all, are highly disadvantaged. I mean, apart from being marginalized, the English language proficiency is a huge issue, not able to drive, being highly dependent on their husbands, who are essentially the perpetrators, mostly in our communities. More than 90% of perpetrators are the husbands of the women we service. Children being trapped and having to witness the ongoing abuse. We saw an increase in the calls that were coming to us, and I think overall the report on sexual abuse was higher. So I think these were some of the issues that we were dealing with when working with these communities. And of course, the challenges that came in from the sector response in terms of how the government departments engaged. And then I think I take what Denise said on board. I think quite a bit of money was thrown at us, NGOs, which actually greatly helped us in terms of enabling some of our client bills to be paid simply because they couldn't go to the post office. You know, they couldn't drive, they couldn't go there, they didn't have any online facilities, or, just delivering groceries because they had children, they couldn't be standing in queues outside grocery stores. So we had to do that kind of stuff, making sure the sanitation products were delivered, and kind of translating some of the hygiene and safety requirements into several languages. So we were all very, very busy. I think we ended up working a lot more than we usually do, because at the back of the mind, we had huge anxiety about how our women would be coping, how our children would be coping, how are the young people coping now that schools were shut, especially during lockdown. So I think we kind of worked in the midst of a whole lot of anxiety, apart from our staff and volunteers being worried about their own selves and their own families as well. So we all carried the worry about safety of our communities along with us 24/7 basis. I think when we talk about family violence in our cultures, it goes well beyond the power and control wheel and how it manifests, because we have the added issue of cultural oppression and culturally sanctioned violence, practices like dowry, the so-called honor-based violence, forced marriage, underage marriages, quietly happening behind closed doors in homes or in religious institutions. So the vulnerability of many of these young people was at very much heightened. I think the restrictions that came with it, with the perpetrator being around all the time, in-laws being around all the time, actually heightened the safety risks of women, children, and young persons within the families. Thank you.
Kia ora noa. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, this, what did we learn from COVID-19? And I do want to support the two previous speakers, because I think, the definition of what is a pandemic really needs to be addressed. For me, as a researcher, as an person that worked in the sector for many years, whānau violence, family violence, sexual violence is a pandemic in this country. So it took an extraordinary pandemic to actually get more resources into the sector. And I think that is a challenge that the government really needs to review in terms of its priorities. And I will say, following on from Denise's kōrero, is that Māori communities, as you will have seen in the first lockdown, got ready before that lockdown. And so they were very rural Māori communities were very proactive in restricting movement through their rohe, making sure their old people are we're safe, and also making sure that their vulnerable whānau were able to be reached as best that they could do. And while we appreciate the resourcing of COVID-19, the challenge remains at a political level as to why is there such a need to not continue that resourcing, the high trust contracting that took place in this time, in this space. COVID-19 hasn't gone away. We will still address it. However, the resourcing to this sector is being reduced. And what my concern probably is at the moment is probably the challenge to the government to think about how do you resource the small rural communities? How do you resource better Māori providers who can work with our people? There is a generic notion that, you know, the rhetoric around family violence is that it comes from within the family, and actually for Māori that is not the case. So, you know, for me, I think that we really need to have frank and open conversations around how do we do what we did exceptionally well in COVID. How do we continue to do that with the government supporting us, not trying to strategize the sector, but to support us in a way where we continue to be focused on transformation and good health of our people. So, you know, the conversation so far is really about the challenges that we face trying to work and trying to be well resourced in a space where this prevalence of violence is only increasing. And so as we look at the USA, which is really accessible today through the many media outlets, in some way that impacts on how New Zealand society is growing. So I really want people to really think about, you know, what is the position of our sector? What is the position of providers in our sector? In particular, where is Māori in this conversation? Denise and I, and the two Denise and I belong to the Tangata Whenua Rōpū, and we are a collective of researchers and academics, and most importantly, we're a collective of Māori providers who are working 24/7 in this space. So our goal is to see a more needs-based type of funding that is actually that is beyond equitable, so that our people can actually our people at the front line can get the resources that we require to address the needs of our vulnerable whānau.
I guess I just want to pick up on what Ree's talked about, and I think, you know, and what Denise said about some of the messaging that's come out of government and its appropriateness for our whānau. We know that our wahine are trapped by the system often. The system itself, the services, have a big role in trapping wahine. So, and then to be, you know, locked down into a home where, you know, what the strategies that they did have to keep themselves and their children as safe as they could within the circumstances have been even diminished further. And I think that's, you know, we make big decisions for the country to suit most of the people most of the time without thinking about some of the issues. And, you know, equity is an issue for our whānau and or the inequities that they face. I think what COVID's going to do is we know from past economic crises and things like that going forward, it's our whānau and other minority groups that are going to be impacted greatly as jobs are diminished and money becomes tighter and what have you. So I think there's a number of issues that the lockdown and subsequent lockdowns have highlighted, and I think with the recent lockdown of us here in Tamaki is nobody really obviously put too much thought into the border and those who live on the fringes of the border. And so what we've seen is some of our whānau being on the other side of the border and unable to go about their day, they go to get their groceries from, a close by venue, or go to the health services or whatever other services they've got. They've actually got to travel some distance to get things like groceries. So, for example, Tuakau used to be able to go to Pukekohe, but now have to go to Huntly while those borders were closed. So, there needs to be some thinking about, so how do those people who sit on the edges of the border, how are their needs met better by rather quite strict, you're in or you're out, and making that difficult. So I think that's just places additional pressure on our whānau and additional stresses, and creates us an environment where violence could flourish. And so I guess lockdowns in this pandemic add on to or superimpose on the entrapment or the lack of agency some of our whānau have, and it's not. We need to think about it a lot more, particularly going forward, because it looks like whānau's not going to. COVID is not going to go away in the near future. It's going to feature in a part of our lives, and it's going to make our lives less predictable. So we do need to be thinking about it, and I think we really do need to take the high trust environment that our Māori providers have been working in during the COVID crisis period, and looking at how that can continue on, so that they can deliver the services that they need for whānau, because they know the whānau in their communities. They know how to access the whānau. They can talk the same language as the whānau, and they can meet their needs before crisis. They can avert crisis in some circumstances. So we really do need to revisit how we're going to go forward with this and learn.
Okay. Kia ora anō. I just want to sort of pick up and leverage off Denise's conversation, and I think it highlights that we were left out of any official responses to COVID, regardless of what lockdown level we were at. Government agencies are now wanting to talk to us about all of those things where we've moved on from there. We'll take the lessons with us. And I think things like issues that whānau were experiencing before lockdown, all related to whānau violence, were heightened during COVID. So those who had no transport, as Denise was saying, but here in the rural communities in Hauraki, some of them, some whānau don't even have registered vehicles. There's no public transport here anyway, so during lockdown. And so those were lots of things. And so there was no thinking, but it's more than that. What it highlighted for us is that these agencies have no knowledge of who we are. They assumed that every Māori family in Hauraki needed a kaipack. Didn't know, no connection to, never had a conversation with iwi, never had a conversation with hapu. Neither did they have conversations with the Māori organisations that are here to get a sense and a feel for what are the real needs to the point where they even closed off the rubbish collections. You know, so because of COVID. So what do you do in a rural community with all of the rubbish? You know, so none of that sort of stuff. And it just, and everything was, there was an assumption that everything circulates around urban areas. Or in this case, when I'm saying urban, like Thames or Pairo or something, nothing about anything else. And there was an assumption that local councils knew what they were doing, and they didn't know. So I think there's still this attitude that one size fits all, and that one size is who? Who's the one size? And the other thing that we saw was, you know, like Sheila had said before and others, that the increase in violence. You know, we saw an increase in women who came to us with concern to sexual violence. So with mahi tūkino, ngauwhiore, there were a range of things happening. We also saw an increase in the number of tauiwi women coming for support. And for some of them, it was most of them, and I'm pretty sure when I say most, I'd be saying about 80% was first time ever they'd ever let anybody know about the violent situation that they had been living in. So I think there are a whole range of learnings in there, but the one for us that's, you know, stands out is that we need the resourcing to develop our own plans to respond to our whānau. Government is such a huge machine, it can't roll in 24 hours. It can't even scramble the army in that amount of time. You know, so I think the reality checks are, where are communities involved, how communities are involved, and these aren't new issues. They just change shape and form, you know. As soon as we get a solution on the ground, someone else takes away the resourcing for that, or comes up with a new strategy, or comes up with a new type of service to deliver the same old with another name. You know, so there certainly needs to be some reality checks. Anyway, I'll just leave that one there too. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. I'm just going to echo everything that's been said before. And I think it is really important, particularly what you were saying, Rahi, that we were already living in a country founded on violence, with intersecting patterns of violence, like huge levels of interpersonal violence, structural violence, the ongoing violence of colonisation. So the women and children experiencing violence in their whānau and families that we were supporting before we went into COVID, they're already living in constricted life spaces. They were already trying to navigate their safety within a system that has completely inadequate safety options for them. And often, as your research shows, Denise, having to seek help from services that didn't know how to give them help in ways that was respecting of who they were and dignifying. And so when you put, if you understand violence as a crime against people's self-determination, and you put a COVID context on top of that, and you limit people's social connections and supports. And so what we saw was also the removal. And so when you lock people in their homes, you remove a whole range of social supports, whether that be neighbours, whānau, family, early childcare, people that are visiting the home, places of worship. So we saw a removal of social supports, but most concerningly, we also saw a removal of the responsivity of services. And so it's not just services to the women and children or family or whānau, but also to the men. And I will mainly say men here who are abusing their partners and their children. So you're having less responsivity with more constraints placed upon your ability to live. And so this was a conducive context for violence, and we saw different responses. So we weren't seeing consequences for people's use of violence. And so then what happens is we've been extremely busy, and I think we fall back to our old ways of working, which is removing women and children from their homes. And if really our work is trying to restitch social connection, then what we've ended up doing is, because our refuges were full, we've ended up putting so many women and children in emergency housing. And I sort of worried about, you know, the long-term effects of this. And I think it shows the glaring gaps that we have around, we haven't developed long-term ways of working with men using violence that are actually transformative in any way. And so this exacerbated the situation, and we still haven't really got a plan. And we know from all the other pandemic research that this is not going to go away. So it's just intensified and made people's lives more precarious and marginalised people more, and it is a massive equity issue. So yes, just echoing what everyone else has been saying, but it is concerning because I think it's recreating ways of working that many of us don't want to be working in.
Kia ora, Rachel. I totally agree. I think that, you know, for Ngai Māori, I do think that we, you know, government's engagement is always going to be challenged by government's way of thinking. And the state has a particular way of delivering, which actually, you know, for us as Māori, we question that. Are you really there to resource us? Are you really, you know, are you really going to, you know, look at responses that are quicker than going through ex-ministries? Because it's the same, you know, for us, I know that during the lockdowns, not a lot changed. Yes, the violence increased, but the activities didn't. Māori communities worked harder. They worked harder as best they could, given the limited resources they received from the state. And I think that part of the issues that we face as the tangata whenua of this country is the you know, the continued colonisation practices of our government. And if we don't recognise that, and if we don't understand that, how is it that we are going to try and move forward in this space? For me, it is the, you know, people don't like the word colonisation and they don't like the word racism, but actually those two kupu, those two words really define the way in which the state has grown in this country. And the notion of partnership is a very scary place, I think, for the state to really engage with. However, in order to be a good partner, I would encourage, you know, the ministries, and I won't name them, you all know who they are, and to really think about, how do I best get resources to Māori communities and other vulnerable communities to do the work they do better than ministries? Because this is an ongoing issue, and this is an issue that really, if I'm going to be really frank, there's lots of money being poured into these ministries and lots of and poor outcomes as a result of that. So, you know, in the tangata whenua rōpū, our forum, we stepped away from the larger family violence and sexual violence group because our voice was not being heard. It was being invisibilized in a bigger kaupapa, and for us, that is the same stuff that we're dealing with every day. Same stuff, hasn't changed for 200 years every day. So politically, we are really trying to have conversations that are really, I think, transformative. So if ministries, you know, want to have a look at the way in which they are currently delivering, they have to come out and talk to our communities. They have to come and talk to Māori. They have to come out and see, and actually probably think about, why were they so successful? Because in the first lockdown, we had I think less than 150 people from our communities had COVID. So that's an extraordinary number to maintain during a 6-week, I think it was 6, or I can't remember now, I'm phased out by lockdown. You know, that's an extraordinary number to achieve during a crisis, a national crisis. And I think the other thing is that our people went out to look after our people despite that COVID-19 crisis. despite it. And one of the things I will say is that, you know, we have been in crisis for 200 years. So we adapt really well to a crisis. We mobilize really well. We think into the space really well. We gather intel really well. And I do take on Denise Messiter's point about, you know, mainstream agencies not having the intel, neither having the intuition to come out and talk to us. So there maintains a very we are still marginalized. I think institutional racism is prevalent, and that needs to be really, you need to look down the barrel of that one, because in order to understand success and what it means, what is the cost to our people, to lose a generation of old people is horrifying. The thought is horrifying. But, you know, we lost those people in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. So we know very well in less than 100 years what we needed to do. So I really am taking a political position in this particular corridor, because I think it's really important for everyone to understand that if you want to work, you know, if you want our community, our whānau, our hapu and iwi to flourish, our people, then it is our people that have our solutions to do that. Ngā mihi.
Can I go first? Okay. I just wanted to acknowledge Rihi for bringing up the issue of racism and the impact of colonization and how it continues to manifest in our societies, communities, and our people. I think as regards migrant and refugee communities, I think the experience of racism has been quite unique in many different ways, especially after the Christchurch terror attacks and the aftermath of that. And I think that is an additional factor that our people had to deal with in the context of COVID as well, because they're simply known as migrants and refugees, so therefore they have COVID. So I think a large segment of our communities underwent that kind of being actually having to front up to these kind of remarks as well. So I think I absolutely acknowledge that if the government can't get it right with Maori, I mean, they're never going to get it right with migrant and refugee communities. And I think we're looking forward to the day when they get it right with Maori, because it's only then we can step up and talk about the diverse and unique needs of migrant and refugee communities. Because many of our communities, we also have a history of colonization. For India, for instance, where I come from, we have a history of 200 years of colonization. So, and the impact still continues to manifest in our communities in various different forms, recognized and unrecognized. So I think coming to in terms of what is our learning and how do we move on from our learnings, or what do we take as part of our learnings? I think I also understand that COVID came in at rather short notice. And I think for government sectors to get their act together, I think would be a tall ask. But I think when we had the first case around March, I think, March, and it's 6 months down the line. So I think I'm hoping that in the continuum that we are in terms of COVID, we're going to be having to face medium to long-term impact. It's not going to go away for the next few months or even a couple of years. And economic downturn, job losses will definitely increase the ongoing vulnerability and susceptibility, especially for women and young people and children actually trapped within abusive relationships. So I think this would require a joined-up approach actually between government and community, and for sectors to get it right. Look at systemic failures that have been occurring over the years, over the decades, and this could be an opportunity to get it right. Have a contingency plan, because who knows, after COVID-19, we might have another major national disaster. What happens in such situations? So I think this is also presenting an opportunity for the government to get it right and to establish clear-cut pathways with government, with non-government agencies, with communities, with AVs, to get their act right. So I think that's the opportunity that could be seized by the government. And I'm sincerely hoping that the JBVU as a joint venture business unit has taken some of that on board. I mean, but it's left to see where that goes. So thank you.
I just want to, I guess, reinforce both of what you're saying, and I think, picking up on that notion of intelligence about our communities and cultural intelligence as well. So what is the best way forward for our whānau or for other groups of people? I think we have well-meaning people who make decisions without understanding the whole family violence, sexual violence area, and they also don't understand our communities, and they probably even less understand what's happening in our whānau. So I think, Rachel talked before about removal of things. I think one of the issues that hasn't been touched on yet is that whole lockdown, stay at home to stay well, removed any space in the day or the week that our women and children may have that relieves the pressure, and so we need to think about, strategies like that have unintended consequences, and I think, we probably had the insight to know what those consequences were, and I think particularly Māori working in the communities definitely knew, so they were quite proactive in some things that they could do. But there needs to be strategies when the space in terms of time and actual locality is not safe. What are the options for our whānau that government are providing? Because I think, yes, remove them, put them into alternative housing, but there needs to be some strategic approach to that as well. And so I guess where I'm coming to with this is in terms of the notion of cultural and community intelligence, then government must be having the information from our communities and our providers that are working with our whānau all the time to be able to get it right. And maybe it's a range of approaches that meet different population groups, but to meet the one-size-fits-all approach, it's not going to work for our whānau. And yeah, and I think too the other thing that is the lockdown. It's prevented whānau from doing, the whanaungatanga, the connectedness and what have you. It's disrupted that, and it's very distressing when things are happening in your whānau and you can't get there and you can't offer them manaaki and the awhi that they need to get through it because of the strategies that's been taken. So I think we need to talk more about this and look at how we can provide our whānau the support they need in safe ways that are going to ensure they're safe from a family violence, sexual violence perspective, but also safe from the pandemic, the COVID perspective as well.
Kia ora. Thank you everyone for all those comments, and I see Denise has got something to share, which is great. I wonder if, I'll go to Denise after this, and I wonder if you just also want to share what you see. You've put forward a range of really important challenges around resourcing, around relationships, around self-determination, around equity, around ways of operating, around sharing power, and I think they're really, really important to recognise in this time that's been really frightening, really anxious, really exhausting and difficult for whānau, for people, for communities, for workers. And I wonder if you also want to share around things that you see maybe that have changed, or maybe opportunities that have looking forward, what opportunities might come out of this time of crisis and intensity, maybe in terms of relationships or connections, or just ways that you see could be a bit of a way forward. And I just wanted to put that in there as well before we go and take some questions from participants as well. So I'll go to Denise next, but love to keep hearing all your contributions, and then shortly we'll open up for questions from participants.
Kia ora anō. In terms of the way forward, each of us have touched on parts of a way forward. I don't think that there is my experience tells me that, and Denise has raised part of it, is that there are many ways to move forward, and we don't all have to be doing the same thing at the same time to create change, to be transformative. We just need to recognise that we're in that state and know who our allies are, and the nature of those relationships that we have with allies that will support us deal with or address some of the issues that we've raised around systemic and structural violence, how that plays out when we're thinking about whānau hapu iwi. And as Māori, we have a responsibility that this government still hasn't got its head around. And that is, as tangata whenua, we have a responsibility to manaaki every other peoples that are living on our whenua, in our communities, and who also access our services. And they're those things cannot be underestimated and underrated, but the reality is they are. And, like you might say, so like with Denise and Ricky, we're part of the tangata whenua ropu, having these conversations. Part of the conversations are around the role and function of the Family Violence and Sexual Violence Joint Venture Business Unit, and how we may be able to have influence that work, as well as some of the thinking that ministers might have. But I want to just talk a little bit about why we haven't called ourselves a kaupapa Māori ropu, and I think it becomes significant in this context. We've called ourselves tangata whenua because each of us in this ropu can whakapapa back to the whenua, can whakapapa back to our atua, can do all of those sorts of things. And the concern, and I'll just say this from a hauraki perspective because I can, is that one of the concerns we have around continuing labelling ourselves as kaupapa Māori providers is that we are seeing a proliferation of tauiwi NGOs who are claiming to be kaupapa Māori, because they might have Māori staff, that they actually know our tikanga, and they know what manaakitanga is and what whānau is. And they, for some reason, government warms to these organisations and provides them with funding to develop services for our whānau. And one of the most recent ones is the whānau resilience stuff. I give this to a tauiwi collective, collaboration, whichever the words people prefer. And then the people who, they give them that contract, and then they come and ask us to share our information, to support these people who they've given a contract to develop services for our people. And you think, hold on a minute. You've given the contract out. Surely you have the confidence in those people to develop the service that you said you wanted them to develop, the service you said you wanted them to provide to our people. Why do you need our knowledge and information? So not only government came to us to ask us that, to support that and share our knowledge and information, our experience, everything we know about our whānau, the organisations that got the contract came and asked us as well. And we're expected, or there seems to be a taken for granted point of view, that we'll just provide our information because that's what people believe they're entitled to. So this whole notion of entitlement and who's entitled and who isn't undermines any notion of wanting to have a mature partnership relationship with other peoples. And an assumption that Māori, we need to work in partnership because we can't do it on our own. We can do it on our own. And we should be able to determine when we need to work in partnership with someone. And what I'm saying by that is like with mainstream organisations, with government agencies. But they assume, you know, we want to work in partnership with you, we want to collaborate with you, Give us all your knowledge and information, but we'll make sure that you who are tangata whenua won't get to design or develop the services for your own people. Because we don't trust you enough. We don't have the confidence in you that we have in people who don't even come from this whenua. And like I said right at the very beginning, you know, we saw the local councils, we saw civil defence. Not one of them knew who we were. We, in the end, from this little village in Manaia, organised our own emergency operations centre. And you know what? It was all run by our wahine. So, you know, those are the strengths of our people. You know, we never forget the past because there are lessons from that. And Rihi's talking about the stuff that happened in 1918. No, we've got mass graves at home. But the other thing that happened in 1918, our people weren't able to access services. We weren't allowed because we were the natives. You know, and the village that I come from was locked off. Not for our own safety, to protect all the tauiwi people who might catch the flu off the dirty natives who lived in the village. And all of that stuff still sits there. So when we look at COVID, it was just a sophisticated way of addressing a pandemic, overlooked the real pandemic, in which other people have said it's all about whānau violence. It is about whānau violence. You know, there are all of those things that occur. So, you know, we need to lead our own way. We need to be trusted enough to have high trust contracts, to develop our responses to the pandemic that we're all some of us live in, some of us work in, the whole pandemic around whānau violence. And we need to lead those ways, and we need to determine who we'll have relationships with, who we'll work with, who our real allies are, and how we strategize with our allies. So, yeah, I just thought I'd say that.
Kia ora. Thank you, Denise. I might just open it up for also questions from the participants. We do want to give you a chance to put your questions to the panelists today. I see that some people have been putting questions in the Q&A box, and anyone else who wants to, please do jump in and type your questions in there. Just having a look through the ones that are here. Some of the questions I can see are general questions, wider questions about family, whānau, sexual violence work, which we can certainly respond to perhaps outside the webinar. I will email people about those questions. We've got one question here: how will this important feedback reach the government? We have had a discussion about writing up some of the comments and information that's been shared in the webinar today, and we will distribute that afterwards. And Rihi would like to speak that as well. Go, Rihi.
Kia ora. Thanks, Nicola. I think that it's important that this information and this discussion, as well as your own organisational conversations, get fed back as much as possible to whatever forums. We certainly will do that here. But I do think it's, you know, we need a critical mass of conversation, so to speak, in order to keep pushing this agenda that, you know, this is a pandemic situation. We are in crisis. You know, the numbers of vulnerable whānau and others are increasing exponentially every day. So, you know, it's not just, what I'm saying is, yes, we will do that in our own forums, and we are doing that. But I think it's really important, whether you work in the sector or you work for a particular organisation, that those messages keep coming through, keep going to state, because it is about, you know, a continued voice towards government. And it's the elections coming up shortly, so this is a good time. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks for that, Rihi. And we've also got a question here about, you know, ngā mihi to Denise for your kōrero, and wondering if other panellists had a response to what Denise Messiter shared just earlier.
Well, I support Denise. I mean, I support all the korero that's gone on today. I think that what this forum is a good example of are people who know the work, are people who know the sector and its reality. I mean, you know, we are all committed in this space, and I've been looking at the panelists' comments in the chat box, and you know, for me, it is really important that we grow not just the sector's capabilities, but also society's understanding of the kind of world we're living in, you know. I've got to say, I was really appalled with a number of Aucklanders who decided to go to their beach houses during the lockdown. What they did is they under-resourced those beachside communities. They you know, brought up all the food, just about all the gas, because they didn't want to do lockdown in their Auckland home. And to me, that talks about the kind of neoliberal way and behaviour that is flourishing in this country. So someone said we need to reset. We do need to reset, but we need to reset far beyond the sector. We actually need to grow not a community of kindness, a community of conscious generosity, where we are helping people more vulnerable than ourselves. So, you know, the notion that our Prime Minister said to be kind to one another, that put a lot of our whānau at risk. Be kind, stay home. So, you know, this is much bigger. This sector is really, is really the eye of the storm. That's what I think. Because outside that, it is much bigger. And so if we don't make societal, if we aren't part of the conscious critiquing of Aotearoa New Zealand, then, you know, this behaviour, this stuff is still going to happen inside state, outside in our communities. So the challenge is to really, really think that we put vulnerable whānau, vulnerable people first. And when the state gets that right, outside its strategic thinking, which means that they have to actually support community growth initiatives. So there's initiatives in this country that have been going for 25 years. They're incredibly successful, but they are the poorest resource initiatives in this country. Now, why is that? Why is that? Well, who is dictating or orchestrating that these amazing initiatives are not being well resourced to replicate, to continue support, to train others? What is happening here? So this, you know, this conversation is a much broader societal and political conversations about how we see ourselves on this land, on this whenua.
I agree with what Rahi and Denise have said fully, and I think one of the issues is that there is always a demand for accountability from the top down. So there's always a gaze on our providers, on our Māori providers, as Denise eloquently says, in their face. So there needs to be also accountability of government and regional decisions and actions and resourcing decisions, be, you know, to the community, to the Māori providers. I mean, at that level, our whānau have a right to know why this decision was made, and it's had this roll-on effect for our whānau, and that decision wasn't made, even though there's a lot of voicing about we could do things a different way and it would better meet our whānau needs. So I think, you know, the continued top-down requirements for accountability don't serve our whānau that well. And we need to be advocating for services, whether it's NGOs or government agencies or what have you, having to be accountable to our whānau and communities and what they deliver and the quality of what they deliver, because I think we've really missed the boat, and we just need to revisit that whole way. And that's one of the things that I think we should be advocating for. And under Te Tiriti, there's an obligation to be accountable to whānau hapu iwi.
Yeah, Rachel, do you want to jump in?
Wanted to support everything that's been said before, and I think it's really important to talk about accountability, because when we talk about accountability, often within the whānau violence, family violence, domestic violence sector, we talk about individual accountability of men. And so people who use violence need to be responsible for their behaviours, but they're not responsible for living in a society that condones violence and other forms of violence against, whānau and our families. And so how do we start to have what we were talking about is power, isn't it? And so it's not just about sharing power, it's about ceding power. It's actually allowing people who are doing the work to do the work in the ways that they know is meaningful and useful to the people that they work with. But for me, how do we start having those conversations of what accountability looks like in that government space? Because as much as we need to have localised responses and ways of engaging, a lot of the people that we're helping and need our help are still involved with national organisations, whether that be rangatamariki, police, or devolved regional organisations such as our district health board. So we do need change and responsivity in those areas as well. So I think we need to be having systemic conversations, and what COVID's brought sharply is how we love to have this sort of brief intervention approach. And what we've been talking about today is, cumulative patterns of harm, the ongoing violence of colonisation, and how there's already been a pandemic in 1918 and what was happening there. So we've got to move away from this idea that we can have a fragmented, short interventions and, everything can just be this kind of rapid response. This will go away. These are enduring patterns of harm. So we actually need enduring ways of responding, because we're not going to get transformational change on this sort of individualistic, brief intervention. It's taken many years to get to where we are now. So it's going to require a huge step up and a public accountability to the people that we serve. And I think that's the thing, is actually how do we do a trickle up rather than a trickle down approach? So, how are we going to be publicly accountable? So we're accountable first for the people who we work with, but often accountability doesn't look that way.
Yeah, Sheila.
Yes, I just wanted to add on to what I think Denise and everyone else mentioned. I think a lot of what Denise mentioned actually, is reflective of the experience of migrant and refugee communities in New Zealand as well, where I think tokenism appears to be the be-all and end-all of everything. I think we have our own struggles with dealing with the dominance from other groups within the wider Tawiwi, and that's an ongoing struggle, coming and claiming that they know what to do, how to work with ethnic migrant and refugee communities. So I think I really endorse what Denise said in these aspects as far as the communities I'm involved with goes. I think when we talk about the need for, I think what we're talking about essentially the need to share power, power sharing between Crown and Maori, power sharing between government departments and NGOs. But I think that's very, very threatening, especially to those who hold the balance of power. And how do we overcome that? How do we overcome that, be able to have safe and uncomfortable conversations, at the same time? And, COVID-19 should have potentially been one of the greatest levelers for all of us as communities as well as government. But I don't think we've even scratched the tip of the iceberg as far as the potential offers. So I think if the government and NGOs, I mean, the NGOs are doing what they do and they always do, 110%, 120%, I think the government can be called upon to use this as an opportunity. While there's so much deficit around COVID-19 in all regards, I think it also presents an opportunity to do things better.
Kia ora, Sheila. And we have a couple more questions along those lines. Just before I go to them, I'll just go to Denise Messiter, who has a question in terms of rural settings and communities being, if rural settings were neglected, how did government get to know the number of people affected by COVID-19 and those were victims of domestic violence and so on? So I think you wanted to speak to that question in terms of working in rural areas.
Yeah, so I know for Hauraki, I can't speak for anyone else in terms of rural areas. We made a decision not to share any information with anybody, with government at that point in time, with government agencies. We were asked to. We chose not to because we weren't sure how that information was going to be used, who was going to be looking at it, whether the information was going to be analysed, to what ends. So we took the view that at that point in time, we would have no control. So that's what we did here. We kept the information, we stored it ourselves, and we'll decide if whānau want us to share that information, we will, but so far no one's been interested. So that's what we've done here. And I suppose, like as we move through the whole economic recovery, that information, whānau, and when I say whānau, I'm sort of talking to the big whānau hapu iwi, may decide that they want that information to be used as part of their own analysis around economic recovery, and all the other recoveries that are required in terms of whānau violence and influenced by COVID. So that's the answer to that one for Hauraki anyway.
Kia ora, thank you, Denise. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A about stats and data, which I'll just quickly respond to by saying there's not a lot of stats available on the effects of COVID in terms of violence. And the reasons for that are that, the data that's available is service delivery data. So it's, police call outs or NGO data and that kind of thing, which is not necessarily an indication of how much violence is happening in the community, because we know that only a small proportion of violence is reported. And particularly when we've had lockdowns and restricted access to help seeking and restricted access to potentially phones and ways of communicating with others with, monitoring and surveillance of technology and that kind of thing, we really don't know yet for people directly impacted by violence enough about how that violence has been impacted by things like lockdowns and wider effects of COVID. So we have really important and rich information from providers and researchers like you're hearing today. And just to note that in terms of stats and also stories from people impacted who are maybe not in contact with any services, then that's information that we don't have yet, and that will hopefully, specific projects would be needed to be able to collect more of that data over time. So we're almost up at time to finish at 12:30. We've got people who need to head off to other hui and other things today. I think you've probably covered a lot of these questions to a large degree, panellists, but I'll just pop these last questions in for any final responses before we wrap up. So we have one here from Deepika asking one asking, when we talk about government getting out of the way, what are the key enablers for Māori and community to be empowered to lead and be accountable for this? And the other question on a similar vein is here. Sorry, just trying to find the question again. Power sharing and decision making in the family violence sector. What does moving forward look like? A collaborating tangata whenua voice nationally to challenge agencies and state, question mark.
Yeah, I'll have a go at that one. I think in the end, if I had to think about it, it's about trust, and it's about actually the ability for state to look at high trust contracting. that in a nutshell would actually be a very good example of power sharing. It's quite, you know, the government demonstrated they could do that during COVID-19 really quickly. The challenge that Māori communities and providers have is that what is different? What's actually different about our situation? We're still this is still in a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, and yet as we go out a lot, it seems to be that funding is commensurate with levels of lockdown. The more lockdown you are, the more funding you might get. So, you know, it's really important that I think in a way the state lends itself to seek better relationships with iwi, better relationships with Māori providers, better relationships with hapu and whānau. That's from us. If the state is reluctant to do that and has a strong desire to go back to business as usual, then our vulnerable whānau and communities will suffer. And right now, we can see that the COVID-19 itself is moving into those vulnerable communities. It's moving out of white communities into our communities. And that is a really big issue for us. So, you know, I do believe that the state needs to be made accountable to us, to our work, to our communities, to our people. Otherwise, you know, they're part of the problem. If you're not part of the problem, you might be part of the solution. But if you are part of the problem, then you will make it worse for us if you're not looking to find solutions that are best fit to meet the needs of our communities. Kia ora.
Okay, kia ora, Rihi. Thank you very much for those really important and strong words to finish us up there. We will finish up as we are out of time. So tēnei te mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Thank you so much to all of our panellists for your really important kōrero on all the challenges and all the thoughts and experiences that you've shared around the situation of the pandemic in the last few months and what we need to do going forward to set ourselves in a positive direction or a better direction that we've been on. Thank you also very much everyone for joining and for all your questions. We do have a short feedback survey which we will share the link to you all afterwards, and would really appreciate your feedback through that. And I'll hand over to Rihi to close us now with the karakia. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi mai aha kia koutou otira kia tātou. Kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui. Kia tautirangi Māori, kia horohi te marino. Kia whakapapapaunamu i te moana. Kia tere te ka roi roi. Kia e moe a tātou nei ara. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki. Kia ora rā.